Chapter 3. "How old would you say the house is?" asked the man. He was standing at the far end of the kitchen, looking through into the small adjoining room that Rob's father used as an office. The woman was looking around her at the kitchen and its old farmhouse parlour furniture. "At a rough estimate," she scanned the walls, windows and ceiling, "I'd say 250 years. The man nodded as he closed the office door, then joined the woman in a close scrutiny of the kitchen and its contents. Helen still sat, wrapped in the blanket, in the big fireside chair. Her head moved from side to side as she watched the man and woman, almost mesmerised by them. And Rob, too, stood by his sister and watched them. The couple seemed to talk and think and work like two experts. "Then again, it's very old land, but arable," said the woman. "Probably been that way for centuries. There could have been other buildings on the same foundations back in time." "Yes," the man nodded, then indicated the furniture in the room. "Genuine antiques?" "I'd say most of them." The woman moved to the refectory table. She rested the flat of her long, delicate hands gently upon the surface of the table, as if to test for something. "This piece alone is about 93.5 years old." The man nodded again. "And the name Jardine?" "Derived from Old French. The boy's father's name is Henry, his mother's Sarah." The woman then pointed to the small blanket-wrapped figure. "The child's name is Helen." Rob stared at the couple in amazement. "How do you know?" he demanded. But the man and woman, still busy with their strange survey, ignored him. Old names. An old house. The man appeared to be addressing the very atmosphere of the room itself. Old possessions. And he paused for a moment, as if working out a sum total in his head. Lots of old echoes. Probably too many. Too many echoes. "A pressure point, then?" asked the woman. The man nodded yet again as he continued to take stock of the room. "Could well be. Could well be it." "You seem to know a lot about us." Rob raised his voice a little this time, determined to get at least a couple of words in. The woman turned her head slowly to look at him. "We do. Yes." "Then perhaps you'd like to say who you are, what your names are." The woman considered this for a moment, then switched on the smile that was reminiscent of a clear, cool blue sky. "My name is Sapphire." She made it sound like a proclamation. "And my friend's name is Steel." Rob gazed at her. "Sapphire?" "Yes." "That's a... what?" "Well, that's a beautiful name." "Thank you," said Sapphire, increasing the smile for Rob's benefit. Steel broke in on Rob's moment of mild enchantment. "There seem to be a lot of clocks in this house." "Oh, yes. My father collects them, makes them work." Steel picked up the nearest clock. He looked at it and listened to it. "So why aren't they working now?" "Because they all stopped when..." Rob stopped also, not quite sure how to explain it. "Yes?" Steel was still looking at him, waiting for an answer. "Well, they all stopped just before it happened." Rob waited for Steel to ask him exactly what he meant, exactly what had happened. But Steel simply glanced at Sapphire before turning his attention to Rob once more. The man had a way of making each question sound like an ultimatum. So where were you when it happened?
Me? Said Rob. I was down here, right here in the kitchen.
And your parents were where? Rob pointed up towards the ceiling.
In Helen's bedroom, at the top. They were reading to her. They read to her every evening before she goes to sleep.
Steel moved across the room to Helen. He looked down at her for a few moments, and Helen's small face looked back up at him. Helen eventually spoke.
"Mama and Daddy," she said in her quiet whisper. "They just went away."
Steele's face seemed completely unmoved. He turned away from Helen and looked at Sapphire for a moment or two. Rob felt that when the two looked at each other like this, they seemed to isolate themselves from everything and everyone around them. "I think we'd all better go up to the top room," said Steele. "Bring the child." Sapphire turned and held out her arms to Helen. Rob was hoping somehow that Helen would not respond to these strangers. But Sapphire had switched on the smile. Helen shook the blanket from her shoulders and raised her own small arms so that Sapphire could lift and carry her. Steele was still holding the medium-sized clock. He pointed to a smaller one that was set on the dresser shelf. "Fetch that, will you?" he ordered Rob. Rob moved to the dresser and reached up for the small clock. The procession climbed the first flight of stairs. Steele, carrying the medium-sized clock, kept his eyes fixed firmly on the stairs and the shadows above. Rob was close behind him with the second clock. Sapphire, cradling Helen in her arms, followed them, the teddy bear doll swinging from the child's hand. They reached the first landing, crossed it, then began to climb the second, narrower flight of stairs. No one spoke on the way up. The second landing was smaller than the first. A vase and a short-case clock were its only ornaments. The clock had stopped at just after 7:15. A cupboard stair door that led to the third flight of stairs in the attic room was still open as Rob had left it. The small procession reached the second landing. Steele halted there. He looked around him, taking note of the case clock as he did so. Sapphire, Rob, and Helen watched him and waited. "What did you hear?" asked Steele. The question came unexpectedly, catching Rob without a thought in his head. "Sorry?" Steele looked at Rob with an expression of weary impatience, as if he, Steele, had every right to ask questions without warning and was also entitled to immediate answers. "What did you hear when the clocks stopped?" Rob thought about it. "Well, there was a kind of silence." Steele regarded him with the same expression on his face. "I want to know what you heard, not what you didn't hear." Rob apologized yet again. "Oh, sorry." Then he remembered. "I heard Helen crying." Steele wandered towards the open stair door and peered up at the landing above. The warm light from Helen's bedroom lamp reflected on the sloped ceiling of the tiny landing. Just a small glow that helped to accentuate the shadows. "And was that all you heard?" Steele was still looking up through the cupboard stair door. "Well, no. There was this sound." Steele turned his head slowly to look at Rob. "What kind of sound?" Rob found it hard to explain. "Describe it," Steele insisted. Rob tried his best. It was like a rumbling sound at first," he said, causing Steele to glance at Sapphire. "Then it became different. It became a kind of tearing sound." But Steele was already leading the way through the cupboard stair door and up the steep steps to the attic. When the four of them had reached the small angled landing, Steele raised his hand. The party halted there. The door to the attic bedroom was still ajar. The light from the small lamp inside the room highlighted their faces. Steel nodded at Sapphire. It was like a kind of signal. Sapphire set Helen down, then moved to the open doorway and stood there. Rob watched her. Sapphire had her hands raised, palms facing outwards. She seemed to be able to examine and measure an atmosphere with the same skill that she used to analyse a solid object. "Yes," she said, and lowered her hands. "It's here. Somewhere." Steel leaned forward and took the handle of the attic bedroom door. "In this room?" Sapphire nodded. "It could well be in that room, yes." Steel pushed the handle and the door swung inwards so that from the landing the whole of the inside of the room could be seen. The room was just as Rob and Helen had left it. The crumpled bedclothes, the fallen book, the rocking chair, the pipe and the pouch. "So where have they gone?" asked Rob. Steel and Sapphire stared into the room without answering him. "My mother and father!" Rob tried again. "Where have they gone? Please!" Steel and Sapphire turned slowly to look at Rob. "I'm afraid we can't afford to tell you that right now," said Steel. "Why not?" Once again Steel did not answer. He turned back to the doorway of the room. "Look, I want to know." Rob raised his voice a fraction. Sapphire was regarding him with the calm, cool look, but Rob decided to make a bit of a stand at last. "I've every right to know. I live here, remember?" he said, maintaining his stand. "Yes." Sapphire was still looking at him. "You live here." "And Helen! Helen lives here as well." Rob moved towards his sister. He took her hand and eased her away as far as he could in the cramped space of the attic landing, just far enough to separate himself and Helen from the two adults. Steel had turned to watch him. "I mean, you two, you arrived here, just like that." Rob tried to click his fingers, but it did not work very well. "This place, well, you can hear cars or people approaching this place from miles away. But you two, you arrived, just like that." He decided not to attempt the finger click a second time. 1.94 miles, to be exact, said Sapphire. Rob stared at her, taken out of his stride. "What?" "The distance of approach to this house." "Oh," said Rob, deciding to work that one out later. "Anyway, I want to know, now!" And he stood there defiantly, holding his sister close to him. Helen simply looked from one person to the next, as if she were waiting patiently for an adult argument to go away. Sapphire continued to look at Rob for a moment or two. Then she smiled. "All right, then," she conceded. Steel interrupted her quickly. "It can't be explained to him." "It can, in a way," said Sapphire, "but not by you, perhaps." Steel jabbed a finger at the attic bedroom. "If we are going to reconstruct what happened in there, then maybe he should know things." Steel looked at her, then decided to say nothing as Sapphire moved towards Helen and took the child's hand in hers. "There is, if you like, a corridor," said Sapphire to Rob. Rob stared at her. "And the corridor, again, if you like, is time. It surrounds all things. It passes through all things." Rob continued to stare at her. "Time?" he asked. Sapphire nodded. "Time." She put her arm about Helen's shoulders and drew the child close to her as she continued to address Rob. "You can't see it. Only now and again. Perhaps a glimpse, that's all. But even that is dangerous. Also, You cannot enter into time. The smile left her face. In its place was the calm, cool look. It was a look that somehow helped to illustrate her theme. The look itself seemed ageless, as if the blueness that she radiated was somehow both the colour and the secret of time. Rob stared at her as she continued with her explanation. But, once in a while, time can try and enter into the present, break in, breaks through, take things, take people. Rob began to realise. He glanced towards the attic bedroom, then back. But this corridor, it's strong, you see. Sapphire was still looking at Rob as she spoke. It has to be. But sometimes, in certain places, it becomes weakened, like fabric, worn fabric. And when there is pressure upon that fabric... Rob recalled the sound he had heard. Time comes in? He asked. Sapphire nodded. Time comes in, reaches in, takes what it wants. Rob looked at the room once more, then at Steel, then back to Sapphire. He looked stunned. And we think that time has broken through in that room, said Sapphire. Broken through the fabric, and taken your parents. Rob was still staring, open-mouthed, as Steel moved towards the attic bedroom door. Come on, he ordered, as he walked into the room.